Hello and welcome to the first of this two-part webinar on understanding metabolic health and energy systems training. In this first webinar, we're aiming to answer the questions: what is metabolism? How do you know if yours is healthy? And how can you improve your metabolism? In the simplest definition, metabolism is the use of food energy to power the body. Food energy comes in as protein, fat, and carbs, which have chemical bonds. The body breaks down these chemical bonds and converts that energy into an energy currency molecule called ATP. ATP is the energy the body uses to power all the stuff it needs to do to keep you surviving and thriving. And it eliminates waste product like carbon dioxide, urea, and water. Now, metabolism is broken down into two opposing but interrelated types of reactions: catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. Catabolic reactions break down molecules to release energy as ATP, while anabolic processes require energy input as ATP to rebuild molecules. So think of when you eat a meal, the protein, fat, and carbs of your diet are broken down into their component parts to be absorbed. Once inside the body has to use energy to take amino acids and build them back into protein. That's an anabolic process. That protein not only builds muscle, but all the tissues of our bodies. The sugars, as glucose and other simple sugars, are built up back into glycogen, which is a storage form of carbohydrate that the body puts into liver and muscle cells for later use. And then it takes fatty acids and remakes fats, which it stores in fat cells. And all of that takes energy, and it happens in the fed state. Now, in the fasted state, you don't have energy coming in, but you still need energy to power the body's needs. So it needs to release energy through catabolic processes, breakdown of protein into amino acids, glycogen into sugars like glucose, and fats into fatty acids. Okay, which then provide the substrates or the ingredients for creating more ATP. So in effect, metabolism is simply energy flux. How well do you take in food energy, store it, release it, and use it as needed to power the body's functions? Now, what does the body need energy for on a day-to-day basis? Well, as a percentage of the total energy your body needs in a day, the majority of it, 60% or even up to 70% by some estimates, is the energy demand to merely keep you alive. It's the energy required to keep your brain working, your heart pumping, and your organs working. And that's called your resting metabolic rate if you're awake and sitting. But if it's called the basal metabolic rate in someone who's unconscious and lying down, sleeping. Now, on top of that, there's a bit of energy required to digest and absorb your food, which is called the thermic effect of food. What remains, which is a minority portion, is that which most people think of when they think of the energy demands of your body, which is the energy that goes into movement. And that can be subdivided into NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. That represents the activity of day-to-day life. So for someone who's on their feet for work all day, they have a much larger NEAT than someone who sits at a desk for their job. And then you have finally the smallest contribution, which is deliberate exercise, which for some people is nothing, but for a recreationally athletic person might be a larger percentage of the total. Okay, so now we know why the body needs energy constantly through the day. So effectively, metabolism is this energy flux, the provision of energy from food into energy that the body can use. In order to understand that second question, how do you know if yours is healthy? We really need to have an appreciation of how this ATP molecule is produced. I want to postulate that metabolic health, having optimal metabolic health, comes down to two things: your metabolic efficiency and metabolic flexibility. So imagine your body is like a car and your metabolism is the engine. Your engine's power is your metabolic efficiency, meaning how well does this engine take fuel to power, to generate a large amount of work. In this case, propelling the car, but in our case, meeting those energy demands we talked about. So how fuel efficient is it really? And then the second component is it metabolic? Is it flexible? In a car's, in an engine, we can think about how well it can use one of two different types of fuel, gasoline or diesel fuel. And in our case, we have two different types of food fuel that we use for pure energy. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Our ability to use those things equally well is our flexibility. So without getting overwhelmed at the graphic here, I'm going to lead you through what you need to know. So listen more to my voice than staring at the picture and the words. This is the inside of a single cell, and we are made up of trillions of cells. Cells are organized into tissues, which make up organs and make up the entire human body. And within each and every one of our cells is the machinery required to create energy from food components into this ATP molecule. So the energy factory is in effect inside each cell. And it's a process known as aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic because it requires the input of oxygen and the supply of oxygen, and it releases carbon dioxide as a waste product. We often think of, and for this reason, it's respiration. So the exchange of oxygen for carbon dioxide, it happens inside the cell. We often think of this respiration process as being related to the lungs. The lungs are merely where the gas exchange comes in and out of the body, but the use and the use of oxygen and the production of carbon dioxide are actually occurring inside your cells. And cellular simply because it is happening at the cellular level. Now, this is being powered by something called the mitochondrion, which is a component inside the cell that is like the energy factory, if you will. It's the thing that takes the oxygen in and generates a large amount of this ATP molecule and produces carbon dioxide as a waste product. And the number of mitochondria you have depends in part on the cell that you're talking about. Some cells have high energy demands and so naturally have more of these in them, like brain, liver, and muscles. But other cells don't have as high energy demands, like red blood cells, and so they have fewer. The other thing that determines how many of these you have in something like muscle tissue depends on how much you use your muscles. The more energy is demanded of your muscles, the more they adapt to having more of these mitochondria. Just like the muscle size itself, it's a use it or lose it proposition. So people who exercise more often tend to maintain better muscle mass out of a need, and they have more mitochondria in those muscles just by virtue of using them. The body is smart and fuel efficient. What it doesn't use, it doesn't maintain. Okay, so someone who is quite fit will have a lot more mitochondria in their muscles as a function of use as compared with someone who's less fit. So imagine that as your energy demands increase with increasing amounts of output, think of the car going from 0 to 100 kilometers an hour. You might be walking around your house using a certain amount of energy, not needing that much oxygen to produce what ATP you need. But as your energy output increases and you work harder, you need to breathe in more oxygen, and you will therefore be able to use that oxygen in the mitochondria to produce all this ATP. And that increases as the work demands increase. That's a concept known, therefore, as your maximum oxygen uptake or your maximum ability to use oxygen. When you tap out, when your body is doing everything it can to use all the mitochondria available to it, to use up as much oxygen as possible, to generate as much ATP as possible, you're at your maximum. And so for someone who is not very fit, they don't demand much of their body in terms of energy output on a day-to-day basis over months, years, they stop having as many mitochondria. Their maximum capacity to take up oxygen and produce ATP is low, and their VO2 max is low. So their maximum capacity to use oxygen to produce ATP is low. And we would call those low aerobic fitness people. And they have a low metabolic efficiency. Their engine just isn't that big. Whereas someone who's been exercising regularly, quite a lot, will have a demand placed on their body that requires their body to adapt, produce more mitochondria, better functioning mitochondria, and as a consequence, have a high ability when needed to uptake oxygen, and their maximum is very high. And those folks have high aerobic fitness and therefore high metabolic efficiency. So your aerobic fitness is as measured by your VO2 max directly reflects your metabolic efficiency, the size of your engine. Are you a Volkswagen? Are you a Ferrari? Now you might say, but I'm not an athlete and I don't need to be a Ferrari. I don't have energy demands like for sports and things like that. So why should I even care? Well, because just like muscle mass declines as a function of aging, so too does VO2 max. And remember I said the body is smart. It doesn't expend energy maintaining tissue it doesn't need. Use it or lose it applies to the mitochondria. So as you get older, and if you don't use the mitochondria, they disappear. And so you don't have that many. And so, you may not care today. Okay. But just like with muscle, if it declines gradually with age and we do nothing about it, what happens is when we get to a certain point in our older life, we lack sufficient mitochondria to be able to mount the energy output of doing day-to-day tasks. So you stop being able to climb the stairs in your house. You stop being able to walk to the store. You simply don't have the energy output because you don't have enough mitochondria to produce that energy from the oxygen you breathe. Your breathing hasn't changed, but your ability to take that oxygen to use energy, to make energy, has changed. And it drops the same way with strength. So you don't maintain sufficient muscle strength as you age. By virtue of aging, eventually the strength threshold will fall below that strength that you need to do day-to-day tasks. Maybe you can no longer reach and grab things from a high shelf, or you can't get up off of the ground should you fall, or even off of a chair eventually. The other reason to be concerned about VO2 max, even if you're not an athletic person, is that VO2 max is actually the single strongest predictor of all-cause mortality. And that's how come this story of fitness as being important to health cannot be overstated. And in order to emphasize this point, I want to talk about some data. That's data that I think everyone should know. And without getting really bogged down by the visual impact of this data, I'm going to walk you through it. So please listen more than you look. So this is a landmark study that was published in JAMA, the journal JAMA, a very reputable medical journal in 2018 by a group of researchers. And they basically looked at a cohort of over 120,000 people and followed them for a mean duration of 8.4 years. And they recorded mortality in this cohort, dying for any reason during that follow-up period. And then what they did was that they looked back and they said, among those who died, how many of those were smokers versus, non-smokers, and how many of them in the cohort, I shouldn't say among those who died, among all the cohort, looking at the death rate among smokers compared to non, or those who had cardiac disease compared to those who didn't. And they compared your risk of death over the follow-up period based on whether you had or didn't have certain known risk factors for death. And so in the red box at the top, they looked at things like smoking, cardiac disease, diabetes, hypertension, and end-stage renal disease. And what they then did was calculate the hazard ratio, meaning how much more likely were you to die over that time if you had the disease compared to if you didn't? So if you were a smoker, you were 1.4 times more likely to die than a non-smoker. That's 140% more likely. It's stated differently. Cardiac disease, 1.29 times more likely, or 130% essentially. Diabetes, 140% more likely to die. 120% more likely to die from if you had hypertension compared with non. Now with fitness, they looked at things differently because you're not fit or not fit. They had to find a way to classify the people. So what they did was they looked at their VO2 max and they said, let's divide them into quartiles. The bottom quartile, under 25th percentile, or the lowest of the group, was low fitness. They categorized below average fitness as being between the 25th and the 50th percentile of the cohort. And then if you were above average for your fitness level, you were in the 50th to 75th percentile, and an above 75th percentile, you were in the high fitness category. And what they found was staggering. What they found was, compared to those with high fitness, those in the lowest fitness category had a hazard ratio for death that was 3.9. In other words, 390% more likely to die. Far, far, far more impactful than any of those other disease risk factors that we previously discussed. The good news was, and the other way to look at this data is that if you had a low fitness level compared to those who were below average, so just the category up, the hazard ratio for death was almost 2. So what that would imply is that by moving from a low fitness category to just below average, you could half your risk of death, or reduce it by 2-fold in effect. So this is something you have control over, and it has a massive impact. You could argue more than some of these known diseases do. So everyone should be concerned with their aerobic fitness and their VO2 max. You don't need to measure it, but you need to know that improving it is important for health reasons, not just because you care about fitness as though it's something related to athletic performance. So coming back to this definition of metabolic health that I propose, we have metabolic efficiency, the size of your engine, your entire ability to meet the demands of high demand energy demands through ATP. You're very efficient at creating large amounts of ATP as needed. And we know now that that matters not just for sports and athletes, it matters for survival. On the other side of the story, we have metabolic flexibility, which comes back to this idea of fuel for the engine. What's going in to make that engine produce the output that it puts out, so the energy output. What we put into a car is maybe electric fuel. We can put in gasoline fuel. Some things run on diesel. So these are the fuels. Well, our human body uses 2 primary fuels to drive energy production. It uses carbohydrate substrates like glucose or blood sugar, and it uses fat or fatty acids. And coming back to the energy machinery within a cell diagram here, we can see that fatty acids feed into the mitochondria directly. They can subsist, the mitochondria can subsist on fatty acids directly. They use oxygen to produce large amounts of ATP using fat as a substrate or ingredient. Carbs, on the other hand, they have to go through this outside of the mitochondrion pre-step. And that pre-step, in the presence of optimal amounts of oxygen, simply flows into this process. So there's just step 1 outside the mitochondrion and then step 2 inside the mitochondrion. So it is also an energy production system that can be efficient and relies on the presence of oxygen. But in the absence of sufficient oxygen, when you're totally out of breath or you can't breathe fast enough to bring energy in, this is the sole system available to you. The issue is that it generates lactic acid. Lactate itself is not the issue, but the acid that accompanies it starts to make your muscles hurt. So I want to explain that this means you have 2 energy systems. You can use 2 different types of fuel to generate an ATP using different pathways. The one pathway that happens outside the mitochondrion uses glucose, and it's very fast. It doesn't need oxygen to arrive. It doesn't need the mitochondria to churn up its whole machinery thing. That stuff is slow. When you need energy in a hurry and you can't get oxygen in fast enough, high intensity bursts of exercise, you need something that works quickly. And this works quickly. It's in the presence of limited oxygen delivery that this can be the sole system, because if you recall, this is an oxygen dependent system, but this happens in the absence of oxygen or with or without it. It can be operating independently. So the side effect, though, is the lactic acid production. That doesn't build up necessarily if oxygen is present. So only if you run out of oxygen for whatever reason, you're working so hard that this is the only system working. Okay. But in the presence of oxygen, these systems kind of work together. But this fatty acid system, the one that sort of feeds directly to the mitochondria, it requires a steady oxygen delivery, and it's slow, but it's extremely efficient, meaning it produces vast amounts of ATP, and it's long lasting, like it's never ending. So you walk around all day, you're using this system because it's just easier. The body can generate a ton of energy doing it and without getting tired. It can just keep breathing off the CO2, the carbon dioxide, and away you go. And at any given time, you're using mostly one, mostly the other, or some mix of the two, basically. And it really depends on how quickly energy is needed and how much oxygen is available for the task at hand. So let's look at this. And again, don't get overwhelmed because I'm going to walk you through this. As you work harder, your effort or output increases. That's like the car going from 0 to 60, okay? It starts to rev faster. The engine revs faster. It needs more and more energy. When it's idling or it's going very slowly, it's just kind of plodding around, it can use this diesel fuel, this forever fuel that doesn't need to come quickly, and there's plenty of oxygen around because we're not breathing so hard. Our output isn't high. And we have the mitochondria doing the work, and really it's cool. We don't need to pull on that other system right now. Fats will fuel the task, but we pull in that carb oxidation system, the first system, that produces lactic acid more and more the more our effort goes out, because simply for the fact that eventually we're exceeding what the mitochondria can provide, and we have to rely more on what's happening outside the mitochondria. And as we continue to rev that engine, we continue to push the output more, the first system kind of taps out and says, I don't have enough oxygen around. The mitochondria are all maxed out. I have to give myself over to letting this other system outside the mitochondria do the lion's share of the work. But that's a really time limited thing, meaning when you're working at this level and you're using carbs or glucose as your primary fuel source, it's tick-tock, right? Because as this is happening, lactic acid is building up. It can't get in the mitochondria. Remember, they're tapped out. Oxygen supply is now a limited resource, and we're operating almost entirely on this gasoline fuel. It's not very efficient at this point, so our energy output starts to be time limited, and also we're feeling the fatigue from the acid associated with lactic acid or lactate. So think about it this way. If you're metabolically inflexible, unfit, here's your effort or energy output. It's very small. This is because you don't have that many mitochondria. Remember that story? And really, you have to tap out of this fat oxidation system pretty quickly. So you don't last long in that zone of energy production that's efficient and oxygen dependent, because you simply don't have many of those pieces of the machinery, i.e. the mitochondria, to begin with. You tap out sooner and you have to rely more quickly on this energy inefficient carbohydrate system that generates lactate. And as we said, you don't have long once that's your energy system. You're going to tap out. So overall, their maximum energy output is very low. These people might get super winded just walking up a flight of stairs because they immediately tap into they're overwhelmed to their mitochondria right away, and they have to immediately go to their carb or glucose utilization system, which doesn't last long. Take someone who's very fit and metabolically flexible, meaning they have well adapted mitochondria, very good at using fat as fuel. They can last on this fuel system a lot longer. Their energy output in that system is huge. And if you take professional athletes, it's massive. These people can go and go and go because their capacity for work, their output in this zone of efficient energy production under pure oxygen, delivery circumstances is tremendous. And only when their work output gets very high later on do they then pull in the second system and tap out with their mitochondria. But their overall workload, their ability to put out energy, in sports, it's obvious what this means, but in day-to-day life, this could mean doing 5, 6, 7, 10 flights of stairs before you feel sufficiently winded. Your output, your fitness is directly related to your metabolic efficiency, but also your flexibility, because your flexibility helps you last longer. So looking at it through a different graphic, because different brains work with different visuals. If you have low overall energy output, here's where you are, and you tap out of your fat oxidation capacity very early. And this is part of the story. You're in a time limited energy production system very soon. Whereas if you're very fit, you put out a lot of energy. It's because, in large part, you have this huge basin, this ability to exist and use your fat oxidation system much longer and put out more energy using that, so that the delay, it's almost like a delay of relying on this time limited system. So I hope this illustrates the answers to the second two questions. How do I know if your metabolism is healthy? How aerobically fit are you? And how can you improve your metabolism? You're going to train your energy systems, your fat oxidation capacity, build more mitochondria, and you're going to also occasionally train your glucose oxidation system. And that, my friends, is the topic of our next conversation. So stay tuned.